Flickering torches threw dancing shadows on the marble as she moved barefoot across the floor, heading toward a wooden shape lurking in the corner. She couldn't stop her hands from trembling. 7 witnesses stood motionless behind her, lamplight illuminating their faces as they tracked her every step. Everyone had told her this was simply tradition, that countless brides before her had gone through the exact same thing, that refusing would bring disgrace to her entire family. But nobody had bothered to explain what the tradition actually meant. Not until right now. Not until they removed the covering, and she finally saw what was waiting for her. The year was 89 CE. Under Emperor Domitian's rule, 18-year-old Flavia Tirsa was about to learn that Roman marriage bore no resemblance to the public ceremony with its saffron veils and tossed walnuts. What took place in private, with witnesses present who could testify in court later if necessary, was completely different, something Rome's own historians would eventually find difficult to put into words, something the Christian Church would attempt to erase from history for centuries. Before we dive deeper into what happened, I'm really curious about where you're listening from right now. It's incredible to think a ritual from 2,000 years ago can connect with people on every continent today. Leave a comment and tell me. The wedding procession had been lovely in its own way. Flavia wore the traditional flame-colored veil that identified her as a bride. Her hair was styled in 6 braids tied with wool ribbons, precisely as custom demanded. The temple sacrifice had proceeded without problems. The sheep's entrails revealed favorable signs. Her father signed the contracts transferring her from his legal control to her husband's, employing the ancient formula that made the marriage legally binding under Roman law. She recited the ritual phrase that countless brides had spoken before her. Uber to Gassas, ego ga where you are Gaius, I am Gaia. The words meant she no longer existed as herself. She now belonged to her husband, to Marcus Petronius Rufus, a grain merchant 25 years older than her, someone she'd encountered exactly 3 times before today. But that ceremony was just the legal starting point. What awaited her at the end of the torchlit journey through Roman streets, inside a house she'd never stepped foot in a room where witnesses had already gathered? That's where the real transformation would take place. That's where she'd discover what Roman law truly demanded of a wife's body. The crowds lining the procession sang vulgar songs, as tradition required. The Fescennine verses were explicit and graphic, describing in shocking detail what would happen to her that night. Young men in the crowd yelled suggestions that made her face burn beneath her veil. Her mother explained this was supposed to ward off evil spirits through the force of laughter and humiliation. But Flavia noticed her mother wasn't laughing. Her mother had cried while fixing her hair that morning, and her last words came out like a warning whispered in fear. Do not resist. Whatever they demand, do not resist. Resisting only makes everything worse. They arrived at Marcus Petronius Rufus's house just as the sun vanished completely. The entrance was adorned with wool and greenery. 2 torches marked this as a location where a marriage would be consummated according to law. The crowd's noise intensified, the songs becoming more explicit. Someone hurled walnuts at her, the shells tangling in her dress folds, a fertility blessing that felt more like an insult. Her husband waited in the doorway, and beyond him she glimpsed figures moving in the lamplight. Too many figures, far too many for an intimate moment between bride and groom. Marcus carried her over the threshold because tradition claimed it was bad luck for a bride to stumble entering her new home, and because the gesture symbolized something ancient, something from a time when women were carried into their husbands' houses whether they wanted to go or not. The door shut behind her, dampening the singing outside, and Flavia finally got a clear look at what waited in the atrium, an elderly woman in ceremonial robes. A pronuba whose job was to supervise everything happening tonight, a priest of unclear affiliation, 3 female slaves holding basins and cloths. An older man with a leather bag of medical instruments resting at his feet, and in the corner, covered in fabric that hid its precise form, a wooden structure almost 4 feet tall. The pronuba stepped forward and grabbed Flavia's hands with a grip that was firm, almost restraining, as if she anticipated Flavia might try to run. "Welcome to your husband's home," the pronuba said. "The sacred rites must now be fulfilled. Here's something almost nobody tells you about Roman marriage. It wasn't mainly a romantic partnership. It was a property transaction, documented and witnessed like selling a farm or a ship. Roman law categorized marriage as conventio in manum, literally coming into the hand, which meant a woman transferred from her father's ownership to her husband's. Before the late Republic, this transfer was total. A husband wielded the same legal authority over his wife that he exercised over his slaves, including, theoretically, the power of life and death. By the imperial era, when Flavia walked that torchlit path, the law had relaxed somewhat. Women could own property. Divorce became possible under certain conditions. But the core principle stayed the same. Marriage transferred a woman from one man's authority to another's, and like all major property transfers in Rome, it required verification. Think about how Romans conducted land sales. Witnesses observed the deal. The property was inspected to verify it matched the seller's claims. Rituals called down divine blessing on the exchange. Boundaries were walked, documents were sealed, and everyone involved understood exactly what was changing hands. The Romans applied identical reasoning to marriage with one critical addition. The bride's primary worth resided in her ability to produce legitimate heirs. Her body was the property being transferred. Her fertility was the asset being purchased. Roman law demanded that both be verified before the transaction could be deemed complete. This wasn't interpretation. Roman legal writings state explicitly that a marriage held no validity until consummated. The consummation had to be confirmed by witnesses because otherwise how could anyone be sure it had happened? The bride's virginity required verification because otherwise how could the husband be certain any children she bore were actually his? Each requirement spawned corresponding rituals that made perfect sense within Roman legal thinking. Rituals that shock modern sensibilities precisely because that thinking is so foreign to how we understand marriage today. The pronuba led Flavia toward the draped figure in the corner. Flavia's heart pounded so violently she could hear it throbbing in her ears. The pronuba's hand stayed on her arm, firm and guiding, permitting no escape. "You must greet Mutunus Tutunus," the pronuba said. "You must request his blessing before your husband comes to you. You must present yourself as tradition demands." Flavia extended trembling hands and pulled away the cloth. What stood underneath was a wooden figure carved with anatomical accuracy into the form of a phallus. But this wasn't a small charm like the ones children wore around their necks to repel evil. This wasn't a garden scarecrow designed to scare away intruders. This figure was sized intentionally, proportioned carefully for a specific purpose that became horrifyingly obvious as the pronuba started explaining what Flavia had to do. The god Mutunus Tutunus was Rome's deity of fertility and sexual initiation. We know he existed because numerous ancient sources reference him always briefly, always with obvious discomfort. St. Augustine, writing in the 5th century as Christianity was conquering pagan Rome, described the practice with fury. Roman brides were obligated to sit upon the wooden phallus of Mutunus Tutunus as a sacred requirement before consummation with their husbands. The ritual was conducted with witnesses present. Augustine was a hostile source, writing to condemn paganism, but his account matches fragments from earlier non-Christian writings that mention the same practice. Lactantius, another church father, labeled it so shameful that merely naming it pollutes the speaker. Arnobius gave the most thorough description, depicting brides forced to straddle the god's emblem while their new husbands watched. The antiquarian Varro, writing centuries earlier with no Christian motivation, mentioned Mutunus Tutunus as a deity to whom brides were presented, using phrasing that suggested physical contact without stating it outright. Modern historians who acknowledge this ritual at all tend to downplay it, proposing the bride merely sat briefly on the statue's lap in a symbolic act. But the language of ancient sources doesn't support this comfortable reading. Augustine's word was insedere, which means to settle onto or mount. Arnobius used terminology implying penetration. Lactantius refused to describe the specifics because they were too shameful, which seems an extreme reaction to someone briefly touching a statue. The stated aim was to seek divine blessing for fertility. The practical purpose, which Romans may or may not have consciously recognized, was preparation. It was breaking down resistance before the actual consummation occurred. It was demonstrating complete submission before witnesses. It was conditioning a virgin bride to accept what would come next. Flavia stood before the figure. The pronuba positioned her, guided her body, instructed her in what was expected. The witnesses observed. Her husband observed. The physician waited to conduct his examination afterward. And Flavia finally understood what her mother's tears had meant, what the obscene songs had been readying her for, what becoming a Roman wife truly required. She could have refused, theoretically, but refusal meant shame for her family, cancellation of the contracts, return to her father's house as damaged property no respectable man would marry. It meant everything she'd been taught about duty and honor would be exposed as false, and she would be exposed as worthless. She didn't refuse. Following the ritual with the statue, slaves bathed her in a basin of perfumed water. This washing held religious meaning, purifying her after the encounter with the god. But it was also practical preparation for what followed next, the medical examination. The physician who had stood silent throughout now came forward. This examination wasn't optional. Before any wedding involving substantial property, a respectable Roman bride underwent verification by a physician or midwife to confirm her virgin status. The examination was recorded, and the documentation became part of the legal record establishing the bride's value. Roman medical writings described the techniques employed with clinical precision that leaves zero ambiguity about what was involved. This pre-wedding examination established a baseline. The bride was confirmed as intact, as never having belonged to another man. Now, after the ritual with mudunus tutunus, the physician conducted a second examination. This verified the ritual had been properly completed, that her physical condition was consistent with what the earlier examination had established, that she was ready for consummation with her husband. All of this happened with witnesses present, whose testimony might be needed if any element of the marriage was ever legally challenged. What strikes modern readers about Roman descriptions isn't just their invasiveness, but their matter-of-factness. The Romans didn't view these rituals as traumatic or troubling. They were simply necessary procedures for accomplishing an important legal transaction. The bride's feelings about being examined, observed, and documented mattered no more than the feelings of a farm being surveyed before sale. Property doesn't have feelings. Property gets transferred according to proper procedures. After the examination, Flavia was brought to the bedchamber that had been arranged for consummation. The room had been decorated, according to custom, with the marriage bed positioned for maximum visibility from the doorway which would stay open throughout the night. Oil lamps provided enough light for the pronuba to observe from her position near the entrance. The slaves who would be required afterwards stood ready in the hallway. Marcus entered. He appeared nervous, which surprised Flavia. She'd assumed he would be confident, commanding. Instead, he glanced toward the pronuba with something resembling embarrassment before approaching the bed. The pronuba spoke, her voice formal and ritualistic. "The bride is prepared. The gods have blessed the union. Let the marriage be consummated in accordance with the laws of Rome and the customs of our ancestors. Let witnesses verify the completion. Let no one question that this woman has become a wife." What happened next lasted several hours. The pronuba observed throughout, occasionally giving instruction when required, making sure the consummation was completed in ways that would meet legal standards. The door stayed open, sounds carried into the hallway where slaves waited. Everything occurring in that bed was semi-public, part of a verification ritual designed to guarantee that no aspect of the property transfer could later be contested. At dawn, the physician returned for a final examination. This confirmed that consummation had taken place, that the bride was now physically altered in ways that marked her transition from virgin to wife. The examination was documented. The pronuba provided formal testimony about what she'd witnessed. The legal transformation was finished. Flavia Tertia was now a Roman wife. She would give birth to 4 children over the following decade. She would run her husband's household competently. She would attend festivals and fulfill all responsibilities expected of a matron of her status. And she would never speak about her wedding night, not even to her own daughters when their marriages were arranged, because what could she say? It was tradition. It was how things had always been done. It was what becoming a Roman wife demanded. Her silence wasn't unusual. It was universal. Roman women didn't write about their wedding nights. Roman men didn't describe what they witnessed. The rituals were so woven into Roman life that describing them seemed pointless, like describing how one breathes. Everyone knew, no one spoke of it. This is why reconstructing these practices demands piecing together fragments from hostile Christian sources, obscure legal references, embarrassed medical writings, and archaeological evidence that only makes sense when you grasp what it was designed for. The silence wasn't conspiracy, it was simply how deeply ingrained these practices were. They were the water Roman women swam in so omnipresent that describing them seemed unnecessary. For 1,000 years, this was what marriage meant in Rome. Generations of women experienced their wedding nights within this framework, understood their experiences through this lens, passed their knowledge to their daughters in whispers that prepared the next generation. The system perpetuated itself because everyone involved accepted its fundamental assumptions. Property must be verified, transfers must be witnessed, marriage creates legal obligations requiring documentation. Women are the medium through which families continue. The logic was internally consistent, even as it was externally monstrous. The end came not from internal Roman reform, but from external religious conquest. When Christianity transformed Rome in the 4th and 5th centuries, it brought fundamentally different assumptions. If women possessed souls equal to men, they couldn't be treated as property requiring examination. If marriage was a sacred mystery, it couldn't include elements the church deemed obscene. If modesty and privacy were virtues, the entire apparatus of witnesses and verification was offensive. The transition took centuries and was never entirely complete. But in cities and among educated classes, the old ways were systematically suppressed, and the suppression included destruction of evidence. Statues of Mutinus Tutinus were smashed or buried. Texts describing wedding night practices were removed from libraries or allowed to decay. Wall paintings depicting traditional scenes were whitewashed. The pronuba's role was transformed into something purely ceremonial. Within a few generations, detailed knowledge of what Roman weddings had actually entailed was lost to everyone except scholars studying fragmentary surviving sources. The Christians who transformed Rome weren't simply erasing embarrassing history. They were attempting to build a new civilization on Roman foundations, while denying what those foundations had actually supported. They succeeded so thoroughly that most people today have no idea what Roman marriage really involved. The comfortable myth of saffron veils and scattered walnuts replaced the uncomfortable reality. But fragments survive. Fragments always survive. Flavia died in the year 131 CE, at approximately 60 years old. She had been a wife for over 40 years. What did she think about her wedding night during all those decades that followed? Did she remember it as trauma, as acceptance, as something in between? Did she want something different for her daughters, or did she accept that this was simply how things were? We cannot know. She left no writings. No Roman woman of her class did. The silence surrounding these practices is the silence of women whose experiences weren't considered worth recording, whose feelings about their own bodies weren't considered relevant to the histories and legal texts that men produced. We know what was done to them. We don't know what they thought about what was done, but we know enough to understand why this history was erased. It revealed something uncomfortable about the civilization we've inherited. Rome is supposed to be the foundation of Western law and culture. Acknowledging what Rome actually did to its women complicates that inheritance. It suggests that civilization and brutality can coexist, that legal sophistication can exist alongside systematic dehumanization. The wedding night rituals of Rome are gone, but the women who experienced them were real. For Flavia Tertia, for her mother, for her daughters, for all the generations of Roman women whose wedding nights were rituals of verification and control, they lived, they endured, they were silenced.